When it's really noisy, do you try to find a quiet corner to hide in? Or when it's really quiet, do you try to find someone to go and talk to? In our story today, there's parts that are really noisy, but then there's parts that are really quiet. So let's open the book to our Bible story called On the Road to the Cross.
Sometimes it was quiet, and sometimes it was noisy. Sometimes there was shouting, and sometimes there was silence, and sometimes there was a strange mixture of noise and quiet on that never-to-be-forgotten Friday. It was early in the morning, and Jesus was standing quietly in front of the noisy crowd. The religious leaders had taken him to Pilate, the Roman governor. They didn't like the things that Jesus was saying, so they had arrested him and put him on trial. They wanted to have him executed, but the Romans ruled the country, so Pilate had to make the final decision. The crowd had gathered to see what would happen. What would Pilate decide? Was he going to live, or was he going to die? Pilate asked Jesus lots of questions that Jesus didn't answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus calmly replied, "That is what you say." Pilate asked more questions, but Jesus stood silently with his head bowed. Irritated that his questions were not being answered, Pilate turned to the noisy crowd and shouted, "I have two prisoners here, Barabbas, a violent criminal, and Jesus, whom some people think is the promised king." The crowd went quiet and listened carefully to what Pilate was saying. "Today," he continued, "I can set one of them free. You choose. Which one shall it be, Jesus or Barabbas?" "Barabbas," the religious leaders whispered to the crowd. "Barabbas!" the crowd shouted to Pilate. "Free Barabbas," the religious leaders whispered to the crowd. "Free Barabbas!" the crowd shouted back. "And Jesus?" Pilate asked them. "What shall I do with him?" "Crucify him," the religious leaders whispered to the crowd. "Crucify him!" the crowd shouted back to Pilate. "Why?" asked Pilate. "What has he done?" But the crowd wasn't listening. They just shouted all the more, "Crucify him!" So Pilate handed Jesus over to his soldiers. They dressed him up as a king, made fun of him, and put a crown of thorns on his head. When the soldiers had finished, they put a heavy wooden beam across his shoulders and led him away to be crucified. The streets of Jerusalem were noisy. They were full of hustle and bustle, and there were people everywhere. The heavy beam, part of his cross, weighed Jesus down as he staggered through the streets. So the soldiers grabbed a man named Simon, an African visitor to the city, and made him carry the beam. Jesus followed silently as they struggled through the noisy streets. Soon they came to Golgotha, the place where criminals and rebels were executed. As the soldiers fixed Jesus to the cross, there was a lot of noise of people calling out, shouting at him as they passed by. "Save yourself if you can," some of the religious leaders stood by and mocked him. "Come down from the cross and then we'll believe in you." But Jesus didn't reply. He just hung there silently. At midday, the sky went black and all the shouting and noise stopped. Everyone was really quiet. No one understood what was happening. Then, at 3 o'clock, on that never-to-be-forgotten Friday, Jesus called out twice, each time a prayer to God his Father, and then he died. The Roman centurion in charge of the soldiers was amazed at what he had seen and exclaimed, "This man really was the Son of God." Later, that evening, in the quiet of the early evening, Joseph, one of the religious leaders who did believe in Jesus, slowly and carefully took his body down from the cross, released him from the beam, and had him laid in a tomb in the garden, far away from the noisy streets of Jerusalem. And there he stayed silently all through the next day.
That was a really sad story, wasn't it? But God didn't let it end like that. Next week, we'll hear about the wonderful plan that God had to bring Jesus back to life. So let's close our eyes for a moment and think about how calm and brave Jesus was, even when everyone was being mean and shouting at him. Think of a time when you needed to be brave and calm, even if you felt like getting angry and upset. Now I'm going to say a prayer. And if you want to make this your prayer, then say Amen at the end. Dear God, thank you that we can ask you for calmness when we might want to get angry and fight back. Amen.